So let's continue with Chapter 23, Antecedent Interventions, and we're going to talk about the high probability request sequence. It's also referred to as high P request sequence. So delivery of a high P request sequence involves presenting a series of easy to follow requests or things that you know have been mastered by the learner, known as the high P requests. Then once they've shown that they can comply with those several high P requests, you would then provide them with the target request or the lower probability request. And this is typically the skill that you're teaching in an acquisition. The high P request sequence serves an abolishing operation. It does this by reducing the value of reinforcement for non-compliance to the low probability request. For example, reducing the value of escape from requests and reducing the aggression and self-injury that's often associated with low probability requests. It's also a non-aversive way to decrease non-compliance, and then it diminishes that escape maintain problem behavior, because then they're making contact with reinforcement for things that they know, and then you would ask them for the low probability request. And this could also decrease that slowness in responding to a request and increase the time used for completing the task. And we apply the high P request sequence by doing the following. So the teacher or therapist would select 2 to 5 short tasks with which the learner has a history of compliance or a mastered task. These short tasks provide the responses for the high P requests. Then the teacher or therapist would present the high P request sequence immediately before requesting the target task or the low P request. One of the first formal descriptions of high P request sequence was by Engelmann and Colvin in 1983. So in short, they used a high P request sequence to increase compliance and for managing severe problem behaviors. There are several terms that refer to this intervention, so some that you might hear are interspersed requests, pre-task requests. Behavioral momentum is a popular one, but it's most referred to as the high P request sequence. And how to use high P request sequence effectively is first selecting from the current repertoire. So the task that you select should be in the learner's current repertoire. It should occur regularly with compliance and have a very short duration. The next would be presenting the request rapidly. So it should be presented in rapid succession with short inter-request intervals, so very fast. And the first low P request should immediately follow the reinforcer for the high P request. Make sure you acknowledge compliance. So learners' compliance should be acknowledged immediately and reinforced. And then using potent reinforcers. So they may emit aggression and self-injurious behaviors to escape from the demands, but making sure that you are using high-quality positive reinforcers. And the third and the last antecedent intervention we'll be discussing is functional communication training. FCT establishes an appropriate communication behavior to compete with problem behaviors evoked by an EL. So in other words, we're teaching the learner how to appropriately communicate their wants and needs, and it should match the appropriate function. And in contrast to the previous antecedent interventions we discussed, it's sensitive to the establishing operations of the maladaptive behavior. So again, you're teaching them to communicate their wants and needs. It's an application of DRA, or as you remember, differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors, and it basically develops an alternative way for them to communicate what they're trying to communicate through these maladaptive behaviors. And in other words, it's the alternative response that produces the reinforcer that's maintained the problem behavior. Alternative responses can take a variety of forms, or there's different ways that individuals can communicate. This includes vocalization, signs, sign language, communication boards, words or picture cards, vocal output systems or assistive technology devices, and gestures. And in 1985, Carr and Durand defined FCT as a two-step process. The first step included identifying the function of the behavior by doing a functional behavior assessment. And the second was using those stimuli as reinforcers to develop the alternative behavior to replace the problem behavior. So if it was for attention, it would be teaching them how to request attention appropriately. If it was for a break, it would be teaching them how to request a break appropriately. And it's very effective for problem behavior that's maintained by social attention or needing that socially mediated attention. And FCT interventions typically involve several behavior change strategies in addition to teaching the alternative communication response. And these other strategies include response prompting, timeout, physical restraint, response blocking, redirection, and then extinction of the problem behavior. So it's a treatment package. The effective use of FCT includes the following. The first is a dense schedule of reinforcement. So the alternative communication response should produce the reinforcers that maintain the problem behavior on a continuous schedule of reinforcement. So that means if they ask for a break versus exhibiting the maladaptive behavior, you would give them the break every time they ask for a break. The next would be a decreased use of verbal prompts. So when we're first teaching the communicative response, we're usually using verbal prompts. And after that response is in the individual's repertoire, the verbal prompts should be reduced and eliminated if possible. So again, this prevents prompt dependence, and maybe sometimes you'll find that learners wait for you to ask, what do you want? And although that's a good prompt, we definitely want to fade that as soon as possible, and we would want them to request independently. And as we've mentioned before, it should be part of a treatment package or used with other interventions. So we want to make sure we're also using behavior reduction procedures. So it could be more effective if we're placing the maladaptive behaviors on extinction. And this is because we want that functional communication to be much more reinforcing than those problem behaviors. And then we want to make sure that we're thinning the reinforcement schedule. So once we've established the functional communicative response on a continuous reinforcement schedule, we want to make sure that we thin that, because what happens when a student learns that every time they ask for a break, they can have a break? They're going to keep asking for a break, right? So then we would move to more intermittent schedule. We would thin that. And then we should only thin it once they've consistently exhibited that replacement behavior. Guidelines for schedule thinning for functional communication training are not the same as those for NCR. So the alternative communication response should remain sensitive to EOs that compete with the problem behavior. Otherwise, you could have recovery of problem behavior. Recommendations for using a procedure for schedule thinning would be first to use a dense fixed interval schedule of reinforcement during the initial teaching. So again, you're going to reinforce